welcome back to the Ladakh Literature Festival of 2020. Our upcoming session for today is When Men and Mountains Meet, a discussion between James Crowden and John Keay. John Keay is a prolific author and has written major histories of India, China and the East India Company, encyclopedias of Scotland and London, and about 20 other non-fiction titles. His latest is The Tartan Turban, The Search for Alexander Gardner. Long resident of Scotland, he reviews for the Literary Review and the Times Literary Supplement. In 2009, he was awarded the Royal Society of Asian Affairs Sykes Medal, and in 2019 was given an honorary doctorate by the University of the Highlands and the Islands. James Crowden is an author and poet living in Somerset. In 1976 to 1977, he spent a winter on the northern side of the Himalayas in the remote Zangskar valley of Ladakh. It was from this experience that he developed a lifelong interest in agriculture and Buddhism. He is now writing a book about Afghanistan and crossing the Hindu Kush on foot via Badakhshan and Nuristan. When Men and Mountains Meet is an online discussion between the revered author John Keay and James Crowden about the 19th century travellers who explored and mapped Ladakh and the Western Himalaya. Men like William Moorcroft and George Trebeck, Thompson and Alexander Cunningham and many more, including Csoma de Koros, who lived in Zangskar for a winter and produced the first Tibetan English dictionary. They were all entranced by the Kingdom of Ladakh, its values and its history.
This is the Ladakh Literary Festival 2020, and I am James Crowden, and I'm interviewing the revered author John Keay about his book When Men and Mountains Meet, which was published in 1977, I believe, and it's really looking at the early explorers and exploration of Ladakh and the Western Himalaya. And John, what gave you the idea of actually plumbing this extraordinarily rich vein of Himalayan travel?
It was a result of a long walk, a trek, if you like, from Kulu Manali to Srinagar in Kashmir, which I made with a friend in, I can't remember when, it was early 1970s, possibly late 1960s. And we walked through the mountains from Kulu up to the Chenab, the Chandrabhaga Valley, along that valley all the way to Kishtwar, and then up through the hills and over to Anantnag in Kashmir and then to Srinagar. It took about 6 weeks and it was most wonderful. It was in the days before trekking was really a commercial activity. We just had 3 porters and the 2 of us, and things. I ain't had a suitcase. I didn't even have a backpack. So we were totally unprepared. But anyway, it was the most wonderful experience, and I got intrigued by how that whole area of at the end of the Himalayas had been explored, when it had been explored, and who had first found the various routes in terms of surveying them and so on. And so I started doing a bit of research, and it was a result of that that I proposed the idea of a book. It eventually turned out to be 2 books because it got rather long. The first volume was called When Men and Mountains Meet and dealt mainly with the Western Tibet and the Kashmir region. And then the second book was called The Gilgit Game and dealt more with the area that's now in Pakistan, the northern areas, Gilgit-Baltistan and the Hindu Kush. So it was 2 books, and they have actually subsequently been reissued as 1, which is just called When Men and Mountains Meet. But anyway, that got me started on the research, and as so often I find that documentary research, archival research is okay, and I enjoy it very much, but I also love doing the traveling as well. So the whole idea was a great, not only inspired by a journey, but it was also a great pretext to do more traveling in the Western Himalaya.
Yes, I think this is a great passion of mine as well, is actually being in the right place with the right people. Actually, it is, you put flesh on the bones. It's not just a dry academic book. When you read your books, you feel you're really there, and you're almost meeting the rather strange and wonderful people that you've sort of uncovered. Do you just want to say a little bit about the title of the book, because that comes from
Yes. When men and mountains meet, it's when men and mountains, not where. When men and mountains meet is a line from what's called a gnomic verse. It's nothing to do with genomes. It's gnomic, like gnomes in the garden, Gnomic, and it means sort of casual writings, by William Blake, the great romantic poet and artist. And Blake had I would call a commonplace book, a notebook that he jotted things down in all the time that he might think he had some use for in a future piece of writing. And this commonplace book, or notebook really, is absolutely full of drawings as well as verses. And that's where this particular verse comes. It goes, "Great things are done when men and mountains meet. This is not done by jostling in the street." So it's a sort of a call to people to get out and actually view the countryside and enlarge their vision of the world and so on. But the odd thing about Blake was he actually never left London. I think he went to Sussex once, but he never left the south of England anyway. So he, as far as I know, he never went near a mountain. And so this injunction to go where men and mountains meet was not one that he followed at all.
It reminds me a little bit of Thomas de Quincey, who was always said he was botanizing in the Himalayas, as he called it, when he was using other substances to enlarge his imagination. But in the mountains, you don't really.
A bit like the highest mountain in the world being named after George Everest, who never, as far as I know, went anywhere near it or saw it.
Yes, I think he retired to Wales. Jostling, but if you were jostling in the main bazaar of Leh, you actually might well have bumped into many of these extraordinary people that you were writing about.
Yes, indeed. I mean, it just so happens that the kind of earliest travellers to the Western Himalaya do seem to have headed first for Ladakh, and it was intriguing from a British point of view because although apparently, although nowadays part of India certainly, and even in those days closely connected with Kashmir, it was actually, of course, a Tibetan, a Buddhist civilization, and so they were intrigued by it, and so it was it naturally appealed to them. There are also other attractions in terms of trade. I mean, Ladakh was then, and probably still is, a great centre for the shawl wool trade, which was the shawl wool comes from goats in Tibet and is transported through Ladakh and down, and largely by Ladakhi merchants down to Kashmir, where of course it was turned into shawls. So it had commercial importance. It also had political importance, but and this kind of spiritual appeal that it was part of Tibet, and so something quite different to what they were used to in India in terms of Indian Hinduism.
Yes, I think do you want to say a little bit about the first travellers that we know of? There were some Chinese pilgrims and also some Jesuits from Goa.
Yes, I mean, most of the explorers that I'm dealing with in these books are from the 19th century, but there had been a previous generation of travellers to the Western Himalaya, of whose travels we know something. Prominent were the Catholic missionaries. Jesuits first appeared in Saparang, in Guge, in Western Tibet, in the I'm just trying to remember, I think it's the 11th century. The Catholics had a mission, obviously, in India, quite a big mission, and a lot of, and of course, Goa was a Portuguese enclave, and so Catholic. And they were always intrigued by the reported similarities between the rites and the rituals and so on of Himalayan Buddhism and those of the Catholic Church, so that, you know, Buddhist society also had a lot of monks, and they had the same worship of saints and so on, and the same use of I mean, there were so many similarities that for a long time it was thought that by these Portuguese Catholics that Tibet must originally have been converted to Christendom and then have lapsed into Buddhism. So they were very keen to make contact with Tibet, and this first mission went to Gugge in Western Tibet, and they did actually make a few converts, and it lasted for quite a few years. I mean, I think about 30 or 40 years. And we have reports of Tibet at that time from these Portuguese missionaries. Later, famously, a priest called Hippolyte de Siri and a colleague found their way all the way to Lhasa. This was in the 18th century, and they also reported not so much on Ladakh. They passed through Ladakh, but they didn't stop there. They went straight on to Lhasa, and so we have their accounts too. And there were one or two other travellers from the other side, from China into Tibet, even as far as Ladakh, from that earlier period. But the explorers that were interesting me particularly were these 19th century, largely British travellers. And of those, the first, and one of the very few really endearing explorers that I can think of. Explorers are not usually very endearing, but this man was, and this was a man called William Moorcroft, who set off from India in 1819 to, this was his second journey. He made an earlier journey into Tibet. The second journey was, he was in charge of the East India Company's stud farm of their horses in Bihar, and he was looking for new bloodstock. And of course, the part of the world renowned for its horses in those days was Central Asia, and so he was heading for, he hoped for Bukhara and parts of Uzbekistan, where horses were thought to be particularly fine. But he set off anyway from India in 1819 with two or three companions, and they passed up. Well, first of all, they tried to cross into Tibet from what's now Uttarakhand in near Mussoorie. And they left it too late. The passes were closed, and so they had to return back down to Himachal, in fact, and then they travelled north via the Kulu Valley to Lahul and on into Ladakh. And they stayed in Ladakh for 2 years. So this was a fairly leisurely kind of exploration. And Moorcroft, who was by profession a vet, he's actually by training a doctor, and he set up a practice not only in Ladakh, but every time he stopped for any length of time, he opened a sort of field surgery and started treating the locals. And he was actually quite a rather brilliant surgeon, and was much appreciated by the local people when he cured, cataracts and gallstones and so on. So his medical services delayed him a bit, but also he was overwhelmingly curious about everything. He wanted to know how people lived, what they grew, where they travelled, what they traded in, what they ate, and so on. And he writes in voluminous length on everything he sees along the way. And so he's a very good observer. I mean, he's not a great writer. It has to be said, most explorers are not great writers, and certainly those in the Western Himalayas, you wouldn't really read them for fun or for distraction, but for information, wonderful. And so the first really full account of Ladakh we have is from the pen of this William Moorcroft. From Ladakh, they went on to Kashmir, and they spent about a year there, and then they headed east through the Punjab, through what's now Pakistan, to Afghanistan, to Uzbekistan, and they were never seen again. The three principals, that's Moorcroft, his companion Trebeck, and a man called Guthrie, all died, all were killed. We're not quite sure which, in the far northeastern corner of Afghanistan. But some of their papers survived, and from these, Moorcroft journal was published, but in a very, very edited form. And so one's never quite sure when reading it whether one's actually reading Moorcroft's own words or the words of his editor. And as I say, it's not a tremendously enjoyable read, but it's incredibly informative. And that is certainly the first major source on Ladakh. I suppose, I mean, there were several other travellers soon afterwards, but the most significant is in the 1840s when the British were trying to define the frontier between Ladakh and Tibet. And twice a border commission, two border commissions were sent up into the Ladakh-Tibet area to trace out a frontier. The first one was very brief. They didn't actually manage to do anything very much. The second one, it was three. The commission was composed of three men: Alexander Cunningham, who was the man in charge, Thompson, a doctor and a botanist, and Henry Strachey, a surveyor. And these three were actually in Ladakh and round Ladakh for quite some time. They went off in different directions, conducting various explorations and so on. Cunningham in particular wrote a massive work on Ladakh, which is the other great source, early 19th century source on Ladakh and the neighbouring regions. And again, it's not a great read, I have to say, but it is wonderfully informative. It's probably the most comprehensive account. It's more like a gazetteer than a narrative, an explorer's narrative, but it's incredibly informative. So, I mean, those two particular expeditions, Moorcroft's and Cunningham's, are the kind of foundation work for our knowledge of Ladakh in the 19th century, early 19th century.
That's a fantastic resume. I was wondering, do you want to say a little bit more about the meeting in Dras, I think it was, between Moorcroft and this rather strange Hungarian linguist called Csoma de Koros, which...
I like the way you pronounce that, James. Can you do that again?
Csoma de Koros.
That's very good. Csoma.
Csoma de Koros.
I've always wondered how to pronounce his first name.
Well, there was a Hungarian once who sort of, I think many years ago I met. He was a very good scholar, actually. Csoma de Koros, yes. Or Sandor.
Yes. I mean, this was a chance meeting. Moorcroft was traveling briefly down the Indus River from Ladakh to Baltistan on a kind of excursion from Leh, and he ran into this lone individual, this lone Transylvanian figure called Csoma de Koros. De Koros was heading for Ladakh, and Moorcroft was heading back to Leh anyway. So they both returned to Leh, and they spent, I think it was 2 or 3 months together. De Koros, as you know, was a man who was interested in language particularly, and he started off as a Hungarian. Hungarians have a language which is different to all other European languages, really, and the origins of it have always been a bit of a mystery. De Koros claims he wasn't looking for the origins of the Hungarian language, but he was certainly inspired by linguistic studies, and he travelled from Europe all the way across the Middle East and through Iran and what's now Pakistan, and he was traveling on his own with a very, very limited budget and basically inquiring about the languages in all these places. And when he reached Ladakh and met with Moorcroft, he became more and more interested in actually Buddhism and the Tibetan language and Buddhism and the Buddhist texts. And he asked Moorcroft to give him a letter of recommendation to the British authorities in India, with the idea that he might be able to get some kind of pension from them in order to spend some time studying the Tibetan language and Buddhist beliefs. And this eventually materialized. Moorcroft gave him his letter. He eventually showed up in Savattu near Simla and submitted his credentials. And but before then, he'd already spent some time in Zangskar on Moorcroft's recommendation, I think, at the monasteries of Zangla and Phuktal, wasn't it? Phuktal Gompa. And he would sit for hours on end in freezing cold conditions, studying texts and compiling what actually became the first ever Tibetan dictionary of Tibetan, Anglo-Tibetan dictionary. And he began translating the great classic canonical works of Tibetan Buddhism. And he would pursue this study for the rest of his life, partly, as I said, in Zangskar, and then well, eventually in Darjeeling in the Eastern Himalaya. And he is one of the great Buddhist scholars. I mean, the story of the rediscovery of the Buddhist the origins of Buddhism in India is a long one. I don't want to go into it now, but de Koros was certainly one of the main contributors to this explosion of scholarship about Buddhist origins in ancient India.
Yes, I think very sadly he died in 1842, going from Darjeeling up into Tibet. He died of malaria, which is sad, but he was really exploring not just the Buddhist mind, but also exploring the scriptures. Cunningham makes me as well, as I think he does you. He was also a great Buddhist scholar and archaeologist.
Yes, I mean, yes, he was the great archaeologist. I mean, Alexander Cunningham was best known not as a Himalayan explorer at all, but as the founder of the Archaeological Survey of India, which of course is now responsible, or has been for a long time responsible, for all the archaeological sites and monuments of India. Cunningham, I mean, in Ladakh, he obviously got very interested in Buddhism, and from Ladakh on his way back to India, he went via the Swat Valley in what's now in Pakistan, and he discovered a lot of well, Swat was an extremely important Buddhist location in the very early days of Buddhism in the BC years, or the BCE years. So by the time he got back to India, he was really bitten by the Buddhist bug, and he spent the rest of his life really looking for Buddhist monuments in India. He used a text which was translated at about that time into French and then into English, of a Chinese traveller in the 8th century who had visited all the sites that were most important to the life of the Buddha. He went to this Xuanzang, he was called. He went to travel to India in the 7th century, and he visited all the sites which were associated with the Buddha, and he left this account of them. And Cunningham used this account by Xuanzang that had been translated as a kind of guide to where all the ancient monuments of Indian Buddhism might be found. And so he traipsed around all these places like Sarnath and Sanchi and Bodh Gaya and so on, identifying their role in the Buddha's life story. And as a result of this, he retired from the army. He was a military officer early, I think in his late 40s, and devoted the rest of his life to exploring these Buddhist sites. First of all, as a kind of private individual, and then he got some money from the government and started setting up this archaeological survey. And as I say, he's much better known as the founder of the ASI, the Archaeological Survey of India, and as the great contributor to this explosion of scholarship that I was talking about in respect of India's Buddhist origins. An extraordinary man. He he lived quite a lot. I can't remember when he died. I think it was in his 70s. He fell off an elephant at some point in his travels and damaged his hip very badly and was lame, and eventually went back, was sent home and died in London, I think.
That's fantastic. Do you want to say a little bit about the botanist, Thomas Thompson, who was the first Englishman, we think, to actually go through Zangskar and leave us some record of its desolation?
Yes, that's a kind of three-man border commission that I was talking about. Thompson was the second member of it. He was from Glasgow. He was a Scot, and he was not only a doctor but also a very distinguished botanist. He was very good friends with Joseph Hooker who was director of Kew Gardens in London, and another great Himalayan botanist, but mostly in the Eastern Himalayas. Thompson, yes, I mean, yes, as you quite rightly said, I mean, he's perhaps best known for the first person to give us a convincing account of Zangskar, and it always seemed to me a very odd choice for a botanist. Zangskar must be one of the places in the world with the least vegetation. I mean, it would be a wonderful place is a wonderful place for a geologist, but it's not the greatest for a botanist. But anyway, Thompson spent some time in Zangskar. As I say, these three members of this border commission went off in different directions at different times, and he spent some time up in the Nubra Valley and actually reached the top of the Karakoram Pass. But he also spent quite a bit of time in Zangskar, and his account is certainly, I mean, I don't think Moorcroft went anywhere near Zangskar, for instance. So Thompson's account of Zangskar is important.
And you mentioned geology. There was a geologist who was there quite a while, Frederick Drew, who also wrote a book. They were very good at writing books, some of these early explorers. Although he was
that's quite a bit later. I mean, Drew was there in the 1870s, 1870s, I think. Yes, and he was employed actually by the Maharaja Rambir Singh of Jammu and Kashmir as a mineralogist. So he was looking for precious minerals on behalf of the Maharaja of Kashmir, and I think he eventually became a governor, in fact, in Ladakh on behalf of the Maharaja. Anyway, by that time, the Dogra Maharajas of Jammu and Kashmir, Gulab Singh and his son Rangbir Singh and so on, had established their rule throughout Kashmir and Ladakh and Zangskar, and Drew was in the employment of the second Maharaja, Rambir Singh, and was looking for probably gold as much as anything else. Tibet, Western Tibet anyway, was quite well known at one time as a source of gold. I mean, even Herodotus talks about these ants that dug up gold dust. We think they were probably marmots, which are sort of little furry creatures, not so small actually, who burrow in the ground and still throw up quite a lot of dust anyway. I don't know how much gold there is, but Tibet was quite famous as a source of gold, and one of the tasks of someone like Drew as a geologist in the employment of the Maharaja was to find out see if they could find any gold reserves in Ladakh itself.
Yes, that's fascinating. Just quickly flip to the 20th century. I believe there were sort of, Sven Heiden was a more than averagely eccentric explorer. Didn't always help these people.
Yes. He's one of my, if Moorcraft is the most, one of those rare things, an endearing explorer. Sven Heiden is the exact opposite. He's a complete egomaniac, and he's an appalling man to work for. All his ponies and things and yaks and so on, they always die. Even when some of his followers lose their lives, he shows no sympathy whatsoever. He was a ruthless traveller, and he really came to Tibet towards the end of his travels. Most of his early travels were in what we now call Central Asia. And these took him further and further east, and particularly to Taklamakan, the desert of Xinjiang in Western China, where various ancient cities were uncovered. And Sven Heiden got excited about this and spent some time there and did some very hairy journeys. And it was from Xinjiang, from Khotan in the south of Xinjiang, that he first crossed the Kunlun range into Tibet, and he made subsequently 3 major journeys in Tibet. He was, like everyone else in those days, he was trying to reach Lhasa. Lhasa was the forbidden city. In those days, I must say, we've moved on, we're now in the early 20th century. Heiden was one of many people who tried to reach Lhasa against the wishes of the Tibetans, who were not at all keen to open their country to foreigners. And he failed in reaching Lhasa. He also was very keen to explore the course of the Tsangpo River when it passes through the mountains in eastern Tibet into India and emerges as the Brahmaputra. That was his other great target. The Tsangpo River and Lhasa. He didn't actually manage to do either of those things, but he did conduct a number of enormously ambitious journeys across Changtang, northern Tibet, and western Tibet. And very often he departed from Leh. He usually pretended he was going somewhere quite different and then suddenly head back into Tibet. He was I mean, the British were quite supportive of him originally, but his kind of his self-obsession, his self-promotion was really too much, even for fellow explorers at the end, and he was repudiated by the Royal Geographical Society and the British kind of travelling establishment when he supported the Kaiser during the First World War, and then later Hitler. And in fact, Hitler and Sven Heiden seem to have headed off rather well. And so Heiden became a kind of German, although Swedish, became a German hero of exploration, really. And the British rather wiped their hands of him, and he wasn't invited back to the Royal Geographical Society for a long time. But he was a great explorer, and his travels they're full of incident. He knows that, the reader likes a bit of excitement, and so he spices them up as much as he can. And I don't know how reliable they are, but certainly his travels, particularly in the Kailash Manasarora region, are important, because he really managed to sort out the confusion about the hydrology, about the rivers of that region and how they found their way down through into India, either west in the form of the Sutlej or east in the form of the Tsangpo and so on, and of course the Indus. So he was a sort of classic explorer, but not a very appealing man, really.
I think maybe we should, towards the end, if you want to say a little bit about the almost unknown Indian pundits, the surveyors for the survey of India, without whom we would not have such accurate maps, I suspect, and it was often a dangerous, secretive.
Yes, I mean, what Nepal's Sherpas were to the mountaineering business, the climbers, Nepal's Bhotia people were to the explorers. A Bhotia is just someone who, it just means Tibetan, it's someone who lives along the Nepal-Tibet frontier in the mountains. And so they're a high altitude people and very much involved in trading until, and still are, but when the British arrived in that part of the world after the Anglo-Nepal War, the Gurkha War in 1816, they discovered that these Bhotia people along the mountains in Nepal had very close links with Tibet, and Moorcroft, in fact, took I think 2 or 3 Bhotia with him, who acted as surveyors in his team, and he, they measured the ground by pacing it out, and so they worked out a particular distance for each pace and could work out how far they travelled each day. And this system of using boatiers to conduct survey work on behalf of the British in Tibet survived throughout the 19th century, and nearly all the great expeditions into Tibet and Ladakh employed boatier surveyors. They were called pundits because the first one was in fact a pandit. He was a school teacher, and the word became a kind of generic term for all these boatier surveyors. They were, I mean, they operated entirely on their own, not with a European or British explorer, but was dispatched on enormously long journeys to Lhasa and to northern Tibet, and right round to the Pamirs and the Hindu Kush and so on. And the Survey of India relied entirely on them for their knowledge of these countries at a time when it was very dangerous for, or might have been dangerous for a European to show their faces in these parts of the world. So the exploration of the Western Himalaya, over the whole Himalayan region really, owed certainly as much to these boatier pundits as it did to British and European adventurers.
That's a fantastic overview. We're just right at the very end of time, but I just thought the people listening would love to hear about your next book, which you are writing, which will be published, I believe, by Bloomsbury, on the main Himalayan mountains.
Yes, I'm actually slightly alarming because I was sent. My book isn't quite finished yet. I've got another chapter or so to write. And I was sent just the other day a book for review, which I thought was my book because it had the same title. It's called Himalaya, and it's by it's very comprehensive and so on. And I was slightly alarmed by this. So this is by a man called Ed Bishop, who I think is editor of the Alpine Journal. And a very comprehensive book, and mine's a bit the same. I mean, it's somewhat the same material, but it takes a rather different approach. But the idea was to write a book about the greater Himalayan region, the whole of that sort of bruised area in the middle of Asia, as it appears on a map, sort of purple and white, which is above, say, 10,000 feet. And I see this as, I wanted to call it Himalasia, but the publishers seem to be objecting to that, so I think it's just called Himalaya. But I see Himalaya as being comparable with, say, Amazonia or Antarctica as a unique ecological and sociological zone which is deserving of the world's attention. Because the region is so cut up by political frontiers and boundaries and buffer states and so on, it's hard to see it as a whole. But we tend to think of it as, you know, this bit's Chinese, this bit is Indian, this bit is a bit of both and so on. But in fact, it has so much in common, the whole region from, say, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan right across to Sichuan in Western China, is one single zone. In fact, the original survey of India was inclined to give it a name. They wanted to call it High Asia, but it never really stuck that. But I think we should start thinking much more, and it makes it much easier to understand all the components of what I'm calling Himalaya, if one has this idea of it representing a single, unique, ecological, historical, scientific, so on, zone, all of its own. So that's the idea of the book. So the book is a kind of a treatment of the whole region. It's not really a straightforward history. It's not really a narrative history. It's a study of the greater Himalayan region. It'll be published. Well, I have to finish it first, but I mean, it will be published at probably the end of next year by Bloomsbury here anywhere in the UK.
Well, thank you very much, John. That's been a completely wonderful overview of exploration, and you are the man to do it. So thank you very much indeed. We are very grateful. And
we haven't talked about your book, but I hope you're going to be doing that in a separate session. But it's I just want to put in a plug for your book. It's a wonderful read, The Frozen River by James Crowden, and it's unlike most travellers' books on. It is on Zangskar. It is thoroughly readable.
Thank you.
Good luck with you. Anyway.
Okay. See you soon.
See you.